I'm Marc Silber. I'm a photographer and author in Carmel, California. And today's episode is brought to you by our friends at Bay Photo Lab. I've been working with them for years. They make prints, they make books, they make cards, they make anything you need in the way of photographs. And they're going to give you a 25% discount on your first order. Please do support them because they're supporting us and helping us with this show. And of course, our guest today, we're joining Dan the Man Milnor. He's a documentary photographer and is currently the creative evangelist for Blurb. Dan loves to strip away false beliefs and myths. Dan, it is so good to see you.
I'm alive, waxing poetic about all things photography or myths or myth busting. There is apparently a television show called Mythbusters.
Yes, sir.
I do not have cable, but apparently it's very popular. And we do love our myths. And I think right now is a good example of how much we love them. All right, let's talk about some myths. Myth number one. I think about this a lot. And the myth is that great photography, truly great photography, happens all the time and is easy. Great photography is still very rare. It's just that we have advances in technology or advances in the industry or advances in the internet, and people assume that because we have these advances that things are better than they actually are.
I have a similar one. You know, Dan, I wrote this down. It's like this is a funny one. Photography, people can either get the false conception that it's really easy and anybody can be a photographer. All you've got to do is get out with your iPhone and just shoot a bunch of stuff. On one hand, that's kind of a myth. And on the other hand, it's really, really hard to become a great photographer. The truth lies somewhere in between those two. It can be easy and it can be hard. You have to work at it, but neither one is really correct.
Well, I think too, you have to understand what great actually is. And to do that, you have to know what's been done that's great. And again, We've talked about this before, but some people have an aversion to studying the history of photography or even studying the industry because they don't want to know. I'll give you an example. I was photographing in Hawaii about 10 years ago. I had worked on this project every year for 10 years. And I came across a young photographer who was working in the same area. And we talked and hung out a little bit that afternoon. And, I mentioned, he was asking about photography, and I mentioned Annie Leibovitz, I mentioned Richard Avedon, and I mentioned Sebastião Salgado. And this photographer said, I've never heard of any of those people.
Never heard of any of those, not even
any of them.
Leibovitz. So
for someone like that, they don't know their definition of great is going to be very different from yours and is going to be very different from mine. Yeah. And so they don't have context. And that's when these films I did last week were very much about doing research on projects because it gives you a context of where your work fits in. It's not a bad thing or a negative thing. It's actually fun to understand what has been done in the industry. And to be able to say, oh, my work, sort of references the same conversation. But the last thing that we've had, so we had digital cameras that came in the late 90s. We had the internet that came in, and then we had social media. And when Facebook in particular started, and all of a sudden you could dump anything you wanted onto these platforms, and people started hitting the like button, then people started to assume that those likes meant that the work was good. Yes. And I don't think that's the case. I think if they're two separate things, and the like button means one thing, but the quality of work really has nothing to do with those two things. And so again, we've sort of convinced ourselves, hey, I got 25 likes and, that must be really good. And there's a lot of people investing their entire career in that ideology, which is very strange. So,
and it's a very huge change in the whole landscape because you didn't before the social media stuff existed, you wouldn't even get exposed to that like or dislike unless you showed your work to somebody or you put it in an exhibit. And even then, you generally didn't hear. You just saw either they're buying it or they're not, or you got feedback, but it wasn't this sort of like, boom, there's this sort of instant gratification, which can be very
well,
deceiving.
I think that's a really good example. So let's say that you have a show in a gallery, or even better, you have a show in a museum, right? Getting a museum show with photography is very, very difficult. That is not an easy thing to do. Although for a museum to display a photography project is often far less expensive than displaying an art project. So during tough financial times, photo shows tend to have more popularity during tough financial times than art. I mean, they have a real resurgence because you can take a show of photography, package it up, and ship it relatively inexpensively, and it can travel from museum to museum. But to get your work into a museum, you have to run through a gauntlet of people who know what great is, and they know their history and they know their context. And if you don't, you have no chance at all. You have zero chance of ever being in there. But the beauty of the museum show, or even a gallery show to some degree, is that it proves that you were vetted by a group of people who know what they're talking about. But you also get exposed to the general public. And what that group of people from the museum has done has chosen you and curated your work to tell the general public, we think this is worth your time, right? And all of this exists outside of the social media world, the internet world, whatever. This is the whole other side. Yeah. And that's why every photographer I know wants a museum show and a book deal, because those are the telltale signs of you have arrived as a photographer. I've got another myth. Oh, this one is hilarious. And this goes directly to the film hipsters in the world, which is, just because an image is made with film doesn't mean it's good.
That's a good one.
Oh my God.
I've got a lot of good photos then. I've got bins of excellent photos just waiting for us.
There's an entire YouTube subculture of film hipsters putting work out, and there's a huge audience for this, which is mind-boggling to me, considering where I came from started in film, came through the digital era, where everybody was like, if you shoot film, you're going to go out of business. And then, everyone transitioned to digital. It was just chaos for a good decade. And to see, one, I love the fact that hipsters have found film. I think it's really funny, but it's good because it's going to hopefully keep that tradition alive. But again, you've got to know what's good and what's not good. And when you're putting up, and look, Kodak is guilty of this too, because Kodak is partnering with some of these people and promoting them, and their work is just not very good. And you're putting work out and saying you're asking for attention, and then you're promoting work that's just not good because it was made on film. The same thing is true. You can go out and get the new Fuji 100 megapixel camera, and just because you're shooting pictures with a 100 megapixel camera has no bearing on whether they're good or not. They might have 100 megapixels. You might be able to make a giant print, but that's no guarantee that what you're making is actually good. So just because it was on film doesn't mean it's good. That's a myth.
That's like saying just because you cooked from scratch, you made a cake from scratch, it's going to be fabulous. Not true. It could be just as bad as coming out of a box.
My wife tried to make brownies the other day, these gluten-free brownies, and they came out more like caulk. Like you could, if you had a leak in your sailboat, you could just hammer these things in and they would probably last for the rest of our lives. They were tasty. The flavor was good, but they were not pretty. It was not a successful experiment. So yes, just because it was made from scratch and made at home did not make it good. And that's the same thing about film. Film is a really wonderful thing. It's a very different way of working. The limitations of film are what make it so interesting. And also the way that film registers light is very different from a sensor. There's a randomness to it, and it just looks wonderful. I much prefer using film to digital. It just doesn't fit my lifestyle at this point and my time. I don't really have much time to shoot anymore. So when I do, I don't really have time for the logistics of film. But that's the second myth we are busting. Okay. I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to go back because a couple of people wrote in with
some myth concepts or comments coming through.
I'm going to combine two of them into one because they're speaking to the same point. And it's something that I run into. This literally is a conversation I have every single week. And I've had this conversation every week for 11 years. And it's it can, for me, it's not frustrating anymore because I've tried to find the positive in this and try to spin people around and sort of, and I've always said that my job is very much about psychology, because photographers and artists and creatives and designers get so wound up in their careers and their lives that oftentimes they kind of lose perspective of the rest of the world. But there's a myth out there that you're going to be a long-form documentary photographer or a photojournalist now, and you're going to make a living doing that. Or you're going to do a book and you're going to live off the proceeds of the book. And those, let's just get those right out of the way right now. The odds of making a living as a long-form documentary photographer, at least in the United States, that's incredibly difficult and rare. And I think there's still a handful of people doing it, namely at agencies, like the big photo agencies, the Magnums, the Sevens, those kind of, because those people have decade-long track records. They have archives
for example.
They have contacts in the commercial world, the advertising world. And even though they're doing documentary projects, they're often doing commercial projects. They're teaching. Their lives are a collection of ways of revenue streams to allow them to go and do some of these projects. But there's so many people in the prosumer space who don't understand the realities of that lifestyle, that it's better to just realize, look, that's not going to happen. In fact, I'll go one step further. You might lose money on every good project you do. And the reason I say that is that's what I did my entire career. And I realized way back in the 90s that if I wanted to do my style of photography, chances are I had to do it on my own. I could not do it on assignment for anyone because you couldn't get the time or the money. And clients always wanted to control things, especially magazine clients and commercial clients. So I realized I had to do it on my own. But two, I realized it was more fun to do it on my own. That way I wasn't responding or under anyone else's thumb. I could do whatever I wanted to do. So ultimately, I saw it as a positive. And the second part of this is the book scenario, where so many photographers come to me and they go, oh, I'm going to do a book with a traditional publisher, and I'm going to get in advance, and I'm going to sell X amount of copies and make money, and I'm going to live off of these book sales. And frankly, I don't know a single person in the world who lives off of their book sales. I don't know a single photographer. And I know people who are selling, upwards of 90 to 100,000 copies of their book, and they're still not using that. They're now nowhere close to living off the proceeds of their book. So again, you got to flip it into a positive where it takes the pressure off, and you go, okay, I really want to do this book, and that's a great idea. That's a good thing. But I know I'm not going to make a living, so I need to make a living doing something else, but I'm still going to do this book. I think you'll actually be far happier, and you'll probably make far better work, and you'll probably find a team of people to work with easier than if you're trying to make a living doing it, because it creates so much pressure and so much, people are freaked and stressed. I went to a party here over the holidays and ran into 3 people in the process of doing book deals, and none of them were happy. They were all nervous, and they realized that they'd invested upwards of between $30,000 and $50,000 into these projects. And one of them said right out, I know I'm never going to see a penny of that. But the other 2 were very concerned. And it kind of bums me out, because you've taken photography and something you love so much, and you've turned it into this stress pressure cooker thing. And it's better to just go, look, I'll do a book, but I'll do it on my own time, and I'll enjoy it, and I'll do the project I want exactly the way I want to do it, and let the chips fall where they may.
Yes. In my case, when you write a book, you have to realize that it's a start of a process. It's not the end of the process. And even John Grisham writes a book every single year. He's got this built-in thing, and he's like probably one of the biggest authors around. But when we're talking about a photography book, is quite different, obviously. But it's the beginning of a process, and if you put the rest of those things in place, yes, it can work. But if you think the book is going to carry you all the way, it's not going to, just as Dan said.
Yeah, the book is incredibly important. And I'll give you an example. I know someone who sold 90,000 copies of a book, and he told me after the fact, he said, I only needed 77 copies because there were only 77 people in the world who I needed to have that book.
Right.
And those are collectors, those are curators, museums, gallerists, and strategic business people like commercial agents, art buyers, etc. Those are the people who are helping make your career. The rest of the books sold to civilians, which is a good thing. And it's remarkable to sell that many books. That's just astounding. I mean, most books
great.
aren't even, most books are, photography books are printed in 3,000 copies or less, and most of them don't sell. So to sell that many is an astounding feat to begin with. But, you know, he said, look, there's 75 people basically in the world that are critical to my career. And I think that's something to keep in mind. That's why it's so much fun to think about doing books on your own, because printing 75 or 100 copies is totally doable. You know, as an individual. It's just that all the rules of publishing have changed and the rules of photography have changed. And I think one of the things, oddly enough, that photographers haven't understood is the power they have, because the industry is faltering, especially now with the COVID. But photographers hold the cards in a lot of ways. And until you realize that, you can never harness the power that comes with holding the cards. And so I think people have to, you know, some people know and other people don't. All right, but let me take a look here of what my tips are.
Let me just chime in on something, and I hope you guys can hear me. So please don't take this as a discouragement. You should be making your books, but you can make them, as Dan was saying, you can make them for those 77 people if you want. You can make them for your friends. You can make them for whatever audience you're going after. Let's see what you got there, Dan.
This is a book that I made in maybe I've talked about this before. This is a book I made in 2007. And to Mark's point, you should absolutely be making books and magazines and collaborating with your fellow photographers and doing collaboration projects. I mean, you're crazy if you don't do that. This was a book I did in 2007. This was $4. Okay. This had 11 photographs, 22 pages. It has the cheapest, the least expensive paper you can get through Blurb, which is an off-color and ivory newsprint style paper.
Wow.
And I did this book. This was technically the most successful book I've ever done. This book today is $2.50. So one of the myths that has to get broken every single day is that you need a coffee table book. You don't. And coffee table books, for the most part, don't sell very well. They never have. And so there's a million ways, a million levels between coffee table book and this.
Yes.
And that's where you get creative and you get strategic. And so it's not saying you don't make a coffee table book, but maybe you make 5 or 10 copies and you put a print inside and you sell those to your top 10 collectors of your work, the people who love your work the most. You sign each book, you number it, you put a print inside, and you sell them for whatever, $500, $1,000, and you sell them. But you can make these small little art books and zines that will make you a better photographer because it forces you to analyze your work in different ways. But also the collaboration factor. I mean, imagine if you collected 3 or 4 or 5 other friends and did a magazine together and everybody gets 10 pages, you know, and you might be spending $1 a copy, you know, to get into a beautiful magazine with a bunch of other photographers. Yeah. And then you don't have any stress of, I have to sell 10,000 copies or I have to pay my mortgage with magazine sales. I mean, Don't even go down that road. Just enjoy the process.
Exactly.
Print it, collaborate, experiment, take chances, try things that you think are crazy with photography and with printing. Otherwise, you're just doing what everybody else is doing. And, you know, there's no fun in that. Lawrence of Arabia said it's better to fail on your own than to succeed on the coattails of someone else.
Okay. And you know that the whole essence of photography, the roots of photography is getting prints made, putting it in books, physical photographs. And Bob Holmes brought up something really cool in our last live stream with him, that at the end of, or part of his workshop program, there were 10 photographers and each one of them submitted their photographs and they made it into a book at the end of the workshop. And those people could order however many copies they wanted and they got them in print and they could show them to their friends and family. It was really cool. It's a really great way to get your work out there.
The Santa Fe photo workshops have a couple of upcoming classes that are online classes, but they're about curating work you've already done and turning that into publications. And they're happening now. And then there's another big one happening in the fall where people are submitting, they're making books now that they will submit when the class starts. And then they're collaborating to make other books while they're there. So that's pretty easy and pretty doable. And again, this is not like you're out spending thousands of dollars. You can literally spend less than $5 and get a really funky, cool little book. And then to me, the format that jumps out for collaboration with photography is magazine. It's inexpensive, the printing's beautiful, and it's big enough, it shows enough real estate to really show off a good body of work. So someone wrote in with a myth, and it's not, I guess you could hear it. So this is Christoph, and is talent, well, maybe this isn't a myth, maybe it's just a question, but we'll do it anyway. Is talent in photography just a myth? And if no, what is talent precisely? Can it be gained? Oh, the thing that jumps out at me is if you haven't read Stephen King's book on writing.
Oh, that's brilliant.
It's called On Writing. And he is not shy about saying if you don't have talent, there's only so much you can do to get it, right? You're only going to go, maybe you can shift up one category, but if you're not great, you're never going to be great, kind of thing. So reading that book is fantastic. But talent in photography is very, very real. It's real. And every generation, there you go, right there, Stephen King.
But he gives one little footnote here, Dan.
Yep.
He gives you a roadmap. What does it mean? Like, talent doesn't just mean you wake up in the morning and all of a sudden you can write like Stephen King. He tells you how he had to bust through and how friggin' hard this guy works. So it isn't just something like, whoa, I've got talent, I can write, you know. He had to work at it, and he tells you how to do it in this book, which is pretty amazing. Oh, yeah.
He doesn't suffer fools, and he works every single day. I mean, hammers. And he's like, look, if you're going to write, you have to read and you have to write. Those are two inescapable facts, and you better be doing it every single day. And he's like, I hear people saying, oh, I can't, I'm busy. He's like, oh, you're in line at the post office? Why are you not reading? Exactly. So, yeah, I love it. And I think it applies to photography as well. I think people don't understand how hard you have to work to get good or get great. But to this person, to Christoph's question, every generation there are a handful of people around the world who show up and they add something entirely new to the conversation, or they are possessed at a level that goes beyond the norm and they transcend what has been done before, and that is talent. And you can see it. I mean, you'll see people who can see the world in a way that's very unlike the normal mass of people. And so talent is real, and you can gain talent, but I'm talking about working every single day, shooting, focusing. I'm not talking about shooting and sharing every day. I'm talking about nose to the grindstone and hammering this stuff out over and over and over again. And most people just don't want to work that hard. You know, and again, photography, you don't want it to not become entertaining. You don't want it to become a chore or labor. And frankly, here's the funny part. For a lot of really good photographers, it is a chore. It is a labor. They don't love this might surprise some of you, but I did enough assisting over the years to know this as a fact. And I've actually had this conversation with some really talented photographers. There's a lot of photographers who don't like being photographers, but they're really good at it. And photography is about problem solving. They just look at jobs that come in as a problem that has to be solved, and they're really good at it. It's like you gave them a mathematical problem, a word problem, and said, solve this, and they get out their pencil and they solve it. And they just happen to be doing photography shoots. And I've worked for some of these people many, many times. And so it's an interesting sort of dynamic to think about that. But I'm
going to throw one out, how we can talk about it too. Follow the rules of composition. Like, there's some law that you have to frame it a certain way, and if you don't do that, you're not going to have a good photograph. There are no rules. There are no laws. There's what works for you. Yes, there are guidelines, and there's things that you should definitely know, and the best way to find those things is by studying works of art and see what you like about them. But be fluid enough so you don't always frame something by the rule of thirds, right, which is absurd, and you have that ability to judge for yourself what is composition.
Yeah, I think I'll add one little caveat, and only because I've heard this literally 10,000 times when I'm giving talks about books, which is someone will come up and they'll say, quote, well, I know I have to do captions. And I'm like, why? Is there a caption police that's going to come to your house and double check that you made captions? You don't have to do captions. There's so many rules in the bookmaking world. I mean, even more than photography times 1,000. However, as a buddy of mine who is a publisher, who's an incredibly talented guy, knows way more about books and publishing than I ever will, he said, you can do anything you want if you justify it. So justify, have a reason for why you're doing it, and you can get away with it. So same with photography. I mean, you look at atypical composition people. I mean, Gilles Perez is a name that jumps out at me in his book, Telex Iran. If you look at the compositions in that, the complexities of what that wide angle street, Iranian Revolution work was, as a college kid at the time, coming from the very standard style of photojournalism that the school was teaching, I saw Gilles Perez and went, whoa, wait a second. What is this? This is not, this guy's breaking every single rule I've ever seen, but this is also like the best documentary work I've seen. So you can do anything. And also what helps is consistency. If you can reproduce those results over time, then people know it's not a fluke. They know that there's a method to your madness.
True that. Let's take a couple of questions and see what's on your guys' mind. Are you aware, and I think this is actually a really good exercise, is to become aware yourself of what's a false belief? What are the real truths that you want to hang on to, and what are the things you want to discard? Because unfortunately, photography, like any technical subject, really any subject at all, can collect a lot of false beliefs that people get hung up on. And, we bust through those a lot. Like, for instance, we talk about the absurdity of getting hung up in your gear to the point where you never photograph. A camera is a tool. You should be able to pick it up and use it, and that's the simplicity of it. And there are many different tools you can use. One lens over another, this idea, wow, if I just had this incredible lens with bokeh, which you've already busted in an earlier episode, that's not going to probably do it, any more than if you're a writer, if you find just the right pen or the right pencil, maybe you'll be able to write the novel of the decade. It isn't that simple, right?
This is a great myth. And I hear this one probably once a month. There is nothing to photograph because everyone is already photographing everything. So basically what they're saying is there's nothing new. There's no new stories because everything's already been done.
Yeah. So
I hear that probably once a month. I often hear it from younger photographers who kind of feel frustrated because they haven't gotten the recognition that they're after, maybe. But I just want to say one thing. I picked up a camera for real in about 1988. And within a month of doing that, and when I started with a camera, by the way, I had no training and I was already doing newspaper assignments. I had a printed copy of what's called the Sunny 16 rule, which is an exposure guide. I had a screw mount Nikkor 35 millimeter with one lens, and I was doing assignments for newspapers. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no training. I was terrified. And in 1988, I heard that expression, everything has already been done. So that's kind of, it's a cop-out.
It's
because
a discouragement, which is...
It is. It's a cop-out because then you have an excuse for why you haven't made anything good.
Right.
And again, I'm going to go back to my first myth that good work is really easy. It's not. You're going to probably break 11 out of every 12 eggs that you do. You're going to try and it's not going to work. And then that 12th egg, you're going to go, hey, I think I'm onto something here. And I think this is a good project and this might have legs, et cetera. But I think a lot of people don't want to admit that they're going to break 11 eggs. They want it to look like every egg is golden.
Yeah.
And so it's easy to go. I mean, look, for example, I got an email from someone yesterday, a comment on YouTube. So I'm going to do a Q&A here in a couple of weeks, hopefully if I have time. And I went out on my YouTube channel and just said, hey, does anybody have any questions? And a guy wrote in, who's a very interesting dude. And he said, look, I've been in Japan for X many years. I think he's English, but he's lived in Japan for a long time. And he wants to do a project about sort of foreign culture in Japan, if I understood him correctly, which is a topic that's been done over and over and over again. But it doesn't mean that he doesn't do it. And he was asking about breaking it down. Do I do like healthcare and city life and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, that's a huge project. I said, I haven't written him back yet, but my answer to that is that's an interesting story, but it's been done to death. But the interesting part is your perspective. You as an individual, an Englishman living in Japan who's been there for a long time, I don't need a lot of photographs, but what I need is a window into why it's important to you. So what are the vignettes, both written and visual, that will explain to you the feeling that you have about why this story is important? That's what we're after. And again, that has nothing to do with equipment. It has nothing to do with quantity of imagery. It has everything to do with being honest and personal, subtle even. And to just say, look, these are the little vignettes and windows into my life in Japan that I think is why it's so incredible for me to be here. And I think this is why you might like it.
And that, Dan, brings up a really important point, which is it's your point of view that you're presenting of the world. It's how you felt. It's what you saw at that moment. You could be standing next to 10 other photographers all shooting the same subject at the same time, but you're going to come away with something unique. So get out there and capture those moments, because that's what it's all about. It's what you feel, what you see. You know, it's all about that moment, capturing that moment. Henri Cartier-Bresson was kind of the father of that, of the decisive moment. But that decisive moment is what you see that's decisive, which could be very different than somebody else. Bingo.
I got assigned, actually more than once, I got assigned to photograph National League Baseball's, what they call spring training here in the United States, which is in the spring. The teams get together in warm climates, Arizona, Florida, California, etc. And 3 or 4 teams will gather in the same complex, and they hold what's called spring training. And it's basically the warm up for the professional season. Everyone's relaxed. The players are a little bit more accessible. I photographed Barry Bonds and Ken Griffey and Randy Johnson. At the time, these were the absolute superstars at the time.
Yeah.
And the thing is, I'm not a good sports photographer. If anyone sending me on assignment to shoot sports is making a huge mistake, because in terms of the peak action of the game, I'm terrible. I like baseball, but I'm not good at photographing it, right? And there are guys who shoot baseball full time who are unbelievably good at it. That's all they do, and they're so good. They're statisticians. They're masters of the game. They know the pitchers. They know what pitches they're throwing. They know basically like where the batter is most likely to go with the ball. It's pretty amazing. Gets overlooked about how talented these people are. But what I realized was, because I didn't know how to shoot sports, I had to come up with a different style of image from spring training. And that was more of a wide angle combination of the fans and the players. And there was this middle distance of where these two groups were interacting and engaging. And that became the area that I spent my time working, not photographing the games, because I knew I just probably was never going to get what I needed to get. So I thought, I've got to figure out who I am as a sports photographer. And I've got to make those pictures. And I did, and it was really fun. And I ended up photographing auto racing and football. And I would shoot professional football games at the NFL with a 50 millimeter on a Leica from the sidelines, and everybody's got 600s and 400s and 300s. And I would have like a Leica with a 50, and I could figure out how to make my pictures from the sidelines. Now, they're not peak action of the game, which I was terrible at. Nothing was in focus when I photographed sports. I was always way off, prior to autofocus. And I'm like going like this, no idea what I'm doing. But it was about making my pictures. And that's what we're all after.
Bingo. Dan, I think we're gonna let you loose on that note. I know you're super busy, and I believe that is a underscored point which we all want to make, which is it's about how you do it. Really, shooting with a 50 millimeter and these other guys with these huge long lenses, you're obviously getting something completely different out of that shoot.
Yeah, no, it was good. Yeah, but thanks for having me again.
Yeah, Dan,
and
always a pleasure.
I'm off to another phone call. Big surprise.
I know, you're a busy guy, and we'll have you back. Thanks again, Dan. Take care.
Bye, everybody.
Enjoy New Mexico.
Yes, adios, and we'll talk again.
I'd like to encourage you guys to keep stripping out of your own view anything that seems like a false or a myth or whatever, there's plenty of them out there. It's really important to dive through that so you can find the real truth for you, what really works. And that comes from your own study, your own use of equipment, so it becomes like second nature, and just going through the entire cycle of photography that I talk about in my book here. Okay. Now, here's the deal. I want you guys to stay connected, so make sure you join the AYP Club because we keep the conversation rolling there. It's actually getting really fun. People are joining in and they're posting their photos. There's all kinds of good stuff in there. I like you guys to definitely plug in. And don't forget, Bay Photo Lab is our sponsor. I'd like you to support them, but support yourself. Dan and I were talking about the beauty and the necessity to make prints and make them in any form, whether it's a card, a small book that you can give to your friends, or prints on the wall that you frame. That's a really important part of the core of photography. So Bay Photo Lab, you'll get your first order 25% off. Get to know them. They're really awesome. And hey, I need you guys to tell your friends about the show. Bring them on board. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't done this already. And of course, we love it when you leave your comments on not just here, but the video will go back up, I believe, tomorrow. Leave your comments there. And we do have a show notes screen with the things that we've covered, some notes and that sort of thing. So that'll go up as well. And remember to get out and capture your own images of life.